Few figures in history have been as controversial and as polarizing as Yoko Ono. Is she the reason why the Beatles broke up in the first place? As the avant-garde artist who became John Lennon's muse, collaborator, and eventual wife, Yoko played a central role in the final years of the Beatles and the decades that followed, especially in preserving John Lennon's legacy. Her presence within the Beatles' inner circle brought a mix of emotions, usually confusion and resentment, particularly from the three Beatles, Paul, George, and Ringo. While the story that she broke up the Beatles still populates the mainstream, it's a lot more complicated than that. Ono's relationship with the remaining members of the band remains one of the most emotionally charged dynamics in modern music history, and the story spans decades. But before the world knew her as the woman who broke up the Beatles, Yoko Ono was already living one of the most fascinating, out there lives imaginable. She was born in Tokyo in 1933 into a wealthy banking family. And that's like proper old money vibes. But she was never the type to settle into a prim little box. She moved to New York in the early 1950s and became the first woman ever admitted into the philosophy program at, and bear in my pronunciation, Gakushuin University in Japan. And then she just casually dropped it all to go and make art. Yoko dove headfirst into the New York avant-garde scene. We're talking about wild performance art, poetic instructions, and painting air with invisible brushes, that kind of thing. She wasn't trying to be a pop star's muse. She was just showing in galleries, staging all kinds of events, and rubbing shoulders with like big artists like John Cage and Andy Warhol, and this was all before Beatlemania even existed. When she eventually met John, she was married to her second husband. So where did she meet John? How did all this fit into her life as one of art's most controversial up-and-comers? So let's just start it all out with Yoko versus Paul McCartney, the big one. Yoko Ono claimed she'd never heard of the Beatles when she met John Lennon. That's not strictly true though, is it, Yoko? She clarified the comments later on in interviews.
Or before, or would you say you were a Lennon fan before?
Neither.
Neither.
But is it really true that you didn't know him and you didn't know the Beatles when you met?
Well, I heard about the Beatles as a social phenomenon. Like I heard about Elvis Presley, but we were into jazz or something like that. More jazz and classic, and Elvis Presley, Beatles coming after that was a phenomenon that was kind of in the distance. So pop music, I wasn't really into it.
So the story goes that John met Yoko at Indica Gallery on November the 9th in 1966. However, Paul later said that she approached him a few weeks before that for some original manuscripts for a project that she was working on with John Cage, some sort of charity project.
I have like my version of the story.
What is your version?
My version is that we were in London and Yoko came around to my house, knocking on the door. Someone said, there's this Japanese lady outside there. I said, okay, let her in. She came in and she said, it's John Cage's birthday, and us artists want to collect a bunch of manuscripts to give him for his, whatever it was, 60th or something birthday.
Right.
And I thought immediately, I don't really want to do this.
Right.
I said, but my friend John might.
Right.
And that's my recollection, that I then said, and he lives here, and she went to see him.
It's actually reported that John did give her a copy of the lyrics for the song The Word. However, it's widely first thought that they first truly met at the Indica Gallery after John was invited by owner and friend John Dunbar. John Lennon was a little in awe of her weird and strange art. Some of the pieces included a simple green apple on a plexiglass pedestal, £200 by the way. Another was a white panel where visitors were invited to hammer a nail into it. John asked if he could hammer a nail even though the exhibit wasn't officially open yet. Yoko told him he could, but only if he paid 5 shillings. John joked, I'll give you an imaginary 5 shillings and a hammer and an imaginary nail. And one that John was particularly enamoured by was a message written on the ceiling which you had to climb up a stepladder to read. Once he ascended, he saw it just said yes and fell in love with the positivity. Not long after that night, they were both inseparable. So that's just a little bit of a backstory on how they met. I don't want to go into the inner workings of their relationship too much on this video. The video is about the Beatles versus Yoko, not John and Yoko. So years pass and Yoko Ono eventually entered the Beatles' inner circle in late 1968, often appearing beside John Lennon during studio sessions. Paul McCartney, who often referred to the studio as a place just for the guys, was unsettled by a constant presence. She didn't often say anything in the studio, simply sitting in silence. Other times, though, she would try and join in and jam with them, which doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me because she kept insisting that she wasn't a fan of the Beatles anyway.
And he kind of showed me like Yellow Submarine and a few other songs, the lyrics, you know. I thought it was kind of simplistic, you know. But still, I felt that the music, the structured music, the form of music was a little bit too simplistic. The chords and you know, the beat is always the same, you know, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, you know.
John never said anything about her being there, never asked for her permission to be there or anything like that. And this bothered Paul, who liked to be in control of the band. And as well, it's not like things in 1968 was smooth sailing. You've seen my other videos. Tensions were already mounting within the band due to the creative differences that they all had, various business disagreements and managers and personal changes. But Yoko's presence became like a perfect lightning rod for the frustration and maybe an easy scapegoat for the fans.
Let's face it, we didn't welcome Yoko in the studio.
I know.
Because we thought it was a guy thing.
Yes.
I mean, even the guys' wives and the girlfriends and stuff weren't really welcome in the studio. They could, you know, control room for a quick visit.
Right.
But actually sit in the studio with us, it was like, no, excuse me, we're working.
Did you have the guts to say that to John?
No.
You did not. If you had said that...
It was kind of obvious, though.
Yes, but weren't you acting out passive-aggressively? You're sitting in the studio, you're just steaming. Rather than saying, John, in a kind of a loving way, this is hurting me. I can't work this way to have someone observing. Everyone was just kind of sniping. We
were just fuming.
Right.
Well,
and sulking and being kind of, you know.
Did John ever say, look, I'm bringing... He didn't ask permission to do it.
No, he didn't. You know, the thing is, it was really just the initial shock of Yoko sitting on one of the amps.
Right.
You know, excuse me, that's my amp.
Yeah.
She couldn't use a stool.
Oh, I would think it would be mind-blowing, Paul.
It was mind-blowing.
And Paul wasn't alone in feeling this way. George Harrison also found it difficult to work with her being there. It's not that she was an issue, it's more the fact that not only John not asked them, but she was just kind of just sitting there in the way, invading on their time together. You know that lad who brings his girlfriend to the pub? She's nice and everything, but she's bringing the vibe down. She's kind of changing the atmosphere, and you can't really be yourself anymore with her around. I think that's kind of what it's like. So I kind of get where they're coming from, really. Paul later admitted it was not just the presence, but the timing of it too. Arriving at the peak of the Beatles' internal stress, and it made her such a disruptive figure in their eyes. Despite this, Paul was the first Beatle reportedly to call Yoko after John and Yoko's car crash in Scotland in 1969. Paul even let them stay on his home on Cavendish Avenue when John had broken up with Cynthia, but felt uncomfortable as they would just sort of lay around staring into each other's eyes all day and watching TV. And taking heroin. Yoko dictated some audio diaries during this White Album period. A lot of the audio is kind of like soppy love stuff about John, but she does note he, meaning Paul, is being very nice to me. He's nice and a very on the level, straight sense. So he must have kept a lot of his thoughts to himself for her to sort of recall that kind of time with the Beatles and that being Paul's reaction. He can't have been very... I don't know, up and front to her. But Yoko seemed to contribute a little bit more on their next album, Let It Be.
Anything you say, dear.
So what do you think to those recordings? I kind of said it earlier in the video, but it makes sense really why they're annoyed at her being there. I think it's more the fact that John didn't ask their permission, making him feel like he was top dog and they had to sort of bow down to whatever he wanted. But just as the fact of her being there and adding this importance, and it's almost like she was like another Beatle. They didn't know whether she was wanting to contribute or if she was just simply gonna be there. I can understand that kind of bothering them really, because the Beatles were they felt themselves as such a sacred group. They didn't want anyone intruding on their time there. There were so many other great musicians who would have loved to have contributed in the studio, and yet it was Yoko that was there, not people like, the guests like they had like Eric Clapton. They probably loved to have had a musician like him around a lot more. But anyway, following the band's 1970 breakup, many fans and critics unfairly placed the blame on Yoko. But I don't think this is racism or anything like that, by the way. I've seen that floated around online a lot. I think it's quite easy to see why Yoko's blamed. John's making strange new music, unlike anything he did in the Beatles, and she's right there next to him on each of these recordings. It's not why they broke up, I've said that before, but it is just human nature to find a scapegoat. And she's a pretty good one. While Paul publicly denied that she caused the split, he later admitted in later years that he privately harboured some resentment. John felt pushed out of John's creative life and space. John wasn't interested in collaborating with Paul in those years. He was getting turned on to the kind of weird avant-garde stuff with Yoko, like he showed on the album Two Virgins. And in interviews during this time, Paul was cautious when discussing her. He didn't want a headline, and that's fair enough. Yoko, though, for her part, defended her relationship with John. She sometimes described Paul as domineering and overly ambitious, traits that she felt contributed to John's desire for independence. She said John was hurt, deeply hurt. He gave everything to the Beatles, and Paul tried to take the leadership away. And Paul was trying to be the boss. So, if she's taking the blame, she's doing her best to throw it right back at Paul, isn't she?
My feeling was he had to clear the decks too. Because if he used to work with Yoko, you couldn't have these sort of Beatle-like appendages coming around with him. Because he had to give his life to Yoko. Yeah. This was the nature of the relationship.
Nature of her demand, you think?
No, his demand. Don't get people get that wrong. John was hopelessly in love with Yoko.
But after John Lennon's sad murder in December of 1980, things started to shift. Paul was famously criticised for his response, "It's a drag," which he later explained came from shock. Like, come on, guys. The man lost his best friend in the worst way possible. Despite their rocky past, though, John reached out to Yoko to offer condolences. She later said that she appreciated the gesture, but was just too consumed by grief to really take it in. And over time, John's death began to thaw the ice between them. You see, Paul grew more reflective, and Yoko, while still guarded, allowed Paul to become part of Lennon's legacy discussions. Throughout the 1980s and the early 1990s, McCartney and Yoko remained kept like a respectful distance. In the mid-90s, Yoko gave George, Paul and Ringo access to some of John's home recordings. That's a huge mark of trust, which culminated in the songs Free as a Bird and Real Love. And by the early 2000s, both began speaking more kindly of each other in public. However, it flared up again between them when Paul shifted songwriting credits on his live album back in the US in 2002. You see, it was always Lennon and McCartney whoever wrote the song. It's always been like that because back in the early days, every song would have been pretty much a collaboration. One would come together with a song and they'd polish it off together. But as they grew apart, they'd come to each other with much more near-finished products. So even though, for example, Paul wrote Hey Jude in its entirety, it's still technically credited to Lennon and McCartney. So on this live album, he swapped some songs on the record to say McCartney and Lennon instead. Yoko was pissed. Paul said he'd previously agreed to keep the Lennon and McCartney order out of respect, but felt it was time to give himself proper credit for the songs that he had mainly written. She didn't react publicly, but people close to her said that she was quietly furious.
You were upset that Paul McCartney, on his new album, he'd switched the credits from Lennon and McCartney, as they've always been, to McCartney and Lennon. And I mean, did you do anything about that? Did you sue him over that, or?
No, I mean, suing is not my style, really. I would really prefer not to do that, but I think it was a bit strange, yeah.
And apparently, too, Paul had asked first about putting the name swap on the songs like Yesterday and Blackbird, iconic Paul songs, and she'd said no, but then did it anyway. In interviews over recent years, Paul started to express regret for how he treated her during the Beatles years, saying it was partly due to a misunderstanding of what love is. He recognised that John and Yoko were deeply in love and that they needed each other in a way that wasn't up for outside judgment, which kind of makes sense in my eyes. You see, Paul's not gonna like her really. She was kind of taking his friend away from him, and the Beatles were falling apart, and I think he wanted to sort of see the distance in John and why it was happening, and she's just such an easy person to blame. John was such a complicated character. His relationships with women really reflect that, and especially being with Yoko, and I think it makes sense for Paul to have a little bit of distance in with her at the start, especially as she sort of dragged him away from the band and helped him pursue these different creative avenues that he went down in the 70s. In 2010, Paul presented Yoko with the Q Magazine Icon Award, publicly praising her for her strength and artistic contributions. By now, they were appearing together at events and were occasionally corresponding. In 2013, McCartney told Rolling Stone she certainly didn't break up the group. The group was breaking up. Yoko expressed gratitude for this change in narrative, stating, "It was so nice of Paul to say that. He's a very intelligent man and a very sensitive soul." Anyway, here's George versus Yoko. George Harrison's relationship with Yoko Ono was marked by detachment rather than direct conflict. It's not always exactly clear what he thought 100% as the Quiet Beatle. Lennon, though, in a Rolling Stone interview, spoke about Harrison's reaction to Lennon bringing Yoko into their coveted inner circle. And George insulted her right to her face in the Apple office at the beginning, just being straightforward. You know that game of, well, I'm going to be upfront because this is what we've heard, and Dylan and a few people said she's got a lousy name in New York and you gave off bad vibes. That's what George said to her, and we both sat through it, and I didn't hit him. I don't know why. Cameraman Les Parrott for the film Let It Be said, "She was a blob in black, always there. You could tell the others resented it, especially George. You had the feeling he wanted to say something. He used to just glower at Yoko." It's interesting to hear this because when George had his infamous bust up with Paul and quit the band, Yoko settled right into George's empty seat. And I kind of just want to bring attention to George and John's relationship though. They were both the spiritual side of the Beatles. They were the ones who took LSD and were a little more into the whole enlightenment thing. More than Paul and definitely more than Ringo. They had quite a strong bond around 1966 and 1967 that's not often spoken about. And Yoko kind of came and got in the way of that. John was now into heroin and avant-garde art. He was just into whatever Yoko was into. We've all been in situations like that where your friend gets a new partner or a new girlfriend and you lose them and you feel like that bond that you had disintegrates because they're spending all their time with them on doing whatever they want to do. It all makes sense. These are universal things that everybody goes through. In an interview during the 1970s, the interviewer asked them about how George had been with Yoko. What about George? George always has a point of view about that wide. He held his hands close together. You know? You can't tell him anything. George is sophisticated, fashion-wise. He's very trendy. And he has the right clothes on and all of that. But he's not sophisticated intellectually. Ouch. Let's not as well forget about the biscuit incident. So during the Let It Be sessions in January of 1969, Yoko Ono reportedly took a biscuit off George Harrison's amp without asking, which infuriated George. The Beatles were always protective of their food in the studio, and for Yoko just to help herself to his chocolate digestives, well, you're gonna be pissed. As the most spiritually inclined Beatle, George often found John and Yoko's public political campaigns, like their beddings and baggisms and the song Woman is the of the world, to be overly performative, not very genuine. And George viewed Ono as a disruptive presence, not just to the Beatles' music, but to their sense of brotherhood in the band. And I kind of get that. Even Yoko defenders have kind of got to get that. George and John also fell out when George invited John to perform some songs at his concert for the Bangladesh, but he didn't want Yoko on stage. John was insulted that George didn't want Yoko, so he refused the offer, and George was insulted that John wouldn't do it without her. George's distance also kind of gave him a neutrality. After the Beatles broke up, he collaborated with John on the Imagine album and the single Instant Karma. George did get pretty pissed off though when John and Yoko were recording an album next door while he was busy recording All Things Must Pass, and he kept coming in to check on him, though that could be just as aimed at John as it is Yoko, to be fair. Still, George never grew close to Yoko in the later years and didn't care to. His priority was maintaining his own spiritual and creative path, and he preferred to keep interpersonal drama at an arm's length in order to maintain his inner peace. Following his death, Yoko said, "George was a very strong spirit. He went on his journey with strength and courage. I'm very sad he's gone, but I'm sure his soul is flying high." Now for Yoko versus everyone's favourite Beatle. When asked about how Ringo treated Yoko, Lennon said, "Ringo was alright, so was his wife Maureen Cox. But the other two really gave it to us." Ringo Starr, often seen as the emotional glue of the Beatles, maintained the most cordial relationship with Yoko throughout the band's turbulent years. While Ringo didn't necessarily approve of Yoko's constant studio presence, he was a lot more accepting than Paul or George, and he tried to remain friendly with John and Yoko after the Beatles disbanded. "She was always there, but it didn't really disturb me. She was John's girlfriend. That's how it was," Ringo said. He also said, "They were two people in love. You can't knock that. She made John very happy." Ringo isn't the type of person to let his ego consume him. George and Paul are pissed off over John's wrecking of the harmony of the studio, but Ringo didn't care, or at least so it seemed at the time. At the end of the day, it's fine if something bothers you, but it's about how you react to the situation. Paul and George clearly got in a strop about it, and Ringo kept it cool, and that's what you need to do in situations like that. And Ringo came through after John's death. He was the first one to publicly support Yoko and Sean Lennon, even helping promote Lennon's posthumous work. When asked about Yoko in later interviews, Ringo was typically generous, stating that he never believed that she broke up the band and that the group was already fracturing from within. "Yoko's a good friend," he told Rolling Stone in 1998. "We've stayed in touch over the years. She's strong." Yoko, as well, has always spoken warmly of Ringo, once saying, "Ringo is a great drummer. Some people didn't give him enough credit back then, but John always knew that he was the best." They appeared together at John's Rock and Roll Hall of Fame induction, and Ringo even staged another bed-in with her in 2015 with actor Jeff Bridges. What a weird trio. So, I know what you want me to answer. Did Yoko Ono break up the Beatles? Well, that's why you're here, right?
They like the idea of us being in a boxing ring, sort of fighting.
Ringo had his own explanation for the band's dissolution. "It was just that suddenly we were all 30 and married and changed," he said. "We couldn't carry on that life anymore. From 1961, 62 to around 1969, we were all for each other. But suddenly you're older and you don't want to devote all that time to this one object. It was time it ended." I've yet to read a better answer to the age-old question of why the Beatles broke up. So perfect.
Is it true that you were responsible of the split of the Beatles? Well, then I must be a very powerful woman. But I don't think that I should take such a credit.
In the end, the relationship between Yoko Ono and the Beatles was never simple, and it was never just black and white. I know that's a boring answer, but it is right. I'm sure Paul has his own thoughts about her that he wouldn't say to anyone, and George will have had the same. But sometime during the mid-1970s, I'm sure they realised that she wasn't going anywhere. She was always going to be John's wife, and that they had to get on with it. I get being annoyed at her in the studio, but she was just furniture. She did no harm. To some people, me partly included as well, she was an outsider who disrupted the Brotherhood. But also, to play devil's advocate, the Brotherhood had already been disrupted. Maybe they would have just found something else to get pissed off over in the studio. I think John's volatile mood swings caused by his addiction issues, adding to the fact that the others felt like they couldn't speak to him about Yoko, probably just heightened the situation. From scouring the internet, there's plenty who see her as a bold artist, his soulmate, and a lightning rod for everything the band was already struggling with. Yes, there were tensions. Yes, lines were crossed. But behind the headlines and the half-truths, there were also moments of kindness, reconciliation, and respect. Paul thanking her, for example, for "Free as a Bird," Ringo calling her a good friend, and Yoko expressing grief, even admiration for George after he passed. And remember, she didn't owe the three of them anything. They didn't always understand each other. They didn't always like each other. But they were bound together by something bigger than just music. They were part of the same epic story that is the Beatles, whether they like it or not. And over time, even the deepest fractures softened into something more human. Yoko wasn't the end of the Beatles. That's my take. Without Yoko, we have no Imagine. Remember that.
Can we please give her the credit for all the nice music that George made and Ringo made and Paul made and I've made since they broke up?
There's plenty of things that I've missed in this video, guys. Please let me know down in the comments below. Anything that, fact check it, anything that you like. It's taken a lot of research and it's gone into this video. So I hope you really, really enjoyed this and I'll see you in the next one.